Take your seats. Our program is about to begin. Please take your seats. Our program is about to begin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. Welcome. I'm Dan Porterfield, the President and CEO of the Aspen Institute. Very excited that we're able to host you today. Definitely the best thing going on in Washington, D.C. is David Brooks speaking about his new book. We're so proud and grateful to host the Alma and Joseph Gildenhorn book series at the Aspen Institute. Thank you so much for your steadfast support and vision for why it matters to convene the Washington community for these book talks, which really have the opportunity both to get great ideas out into discussion, but also to build a community right here in this room. So thank you so much, Alma and Joe, for all you do for the Institute and for this city. Thank you. Of course, David Brooks on The Second Mountain, The Quest for a Moral Life, is one of the hot topics in the country right now. David is one of our country's leading minds, not only for his political writing and commentary, but also for his reflection on and contemplation on those deep and essential questions that all of us as human beings share. He's known for leading big conversations, for shaping big conversations about national, community, humanistic values, as well as the interplay between our political or among our political, social, personal lives. No doubt you know him from being one of the most influential op-ed columnists in the world through his position with the New York Times and all the other writing he's done in the Wall Street Journal, Atlantic, Weekly Standard. He also appears regularly on PBS NewsHour, Meet the Press. This isn't his first book, The Social Animal, The Road to Character. Again, David's found a way to synthesize some existing ideas and then add his own in a way that reframes really important issues. It's really cool that we have the Columbia Heights Education Campus here today, the students in the back. Thank you all for coming. I hope it feels fun to be here. You may not know it, but the Aspen Institute is getting younger every year, and you're the evidence. And we hope this is a fun day for you. You can go back home to your families and back to your classmates and teachers and share a little bit about what David had to say, and maybe ask some questions during the give and take. I bet you that Mr. Brooks will be looking your way first. I want to say a word about David. I'm very proud that David, who's been a longtime member of the Aspen community, has actually come here to work in the last year. For most people, writing books, New York Times columns, et cetera, would be a lot. How could you do more? But David came to us and said he had an idea, a thought, that all around this country there were women and men, young people of all ages, who were putting their minds and hearts and souls on the line to make a difference. And they were doing that on different issues. And for some, it might be sort of economic opportunity. For some, it might be healing political divide. For some, it might be violence prevention. For some, it might be reconciliation of some form. But they're working in different ways. It might be empowering youth. But the same calling. The calling was to bring people together, to reject the divide of us versus them, and to find a better way to live, a better way to bring people together. And David said to us, I think there's something real there that is an antidote, perhaps, certainly a counter-narrative to all the polarization and the sort of bitter, acrid commentary back and forth, people talking past each other, not listening. It's been pretty cool to have somebody with a platform like David's be willing to just travel the country, often on the advice of different colleagues in the Aspen Institute, working in rural or urban America or working in schools in some way, to travel the country, sit down, break bread, listen to people at the local level who are doing something really important, often with no understanding that they're even being interviewed by somebody who writes the New York Times all the time and can really shine a spotlight on their issues. There's an incredible humility of spirit that comes from saying, despite whatever platform we might have, and his platform is an awesome one, but our platform, the Aspen Institute, is pretty great too, to be able to say, I have more to learn. I have people to learn from. I want to get out of my sort of own universe where I'm comfortable and see the world through the eyes of others and see what I can learn. And what David has done with his project, our project, Weave the Social Fabric, is begin to allow the Aspen Institute in new ways to hear the voices of difference makers, change makers, and active citizens in a way that renews our mission and allows us to know in still more beautiful human ways why what we do is so important. It turns out that Weave, as a project, has identified weavers who are bringing together community, but it's also weaving the Aspen Institute. It's allowing some of our programs to connect. It's allowing us to feel still more profoundly why it matters that we get up every day and do our very best work for this country and for this world. And David's joining our community in this project gives us that much more reason to be very proud of this great book that he's written and proud that he's in dialogue with you about what it means, what we can take from it. So David, just with a great deal of respect and gratitude, if not awe, thank you so much for being here today, for being a leader in the Aspen community and helping us create the next chapter of our great service. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I've watched Dan fist bump his way across this office for the last year or so. I'm always suspicious of people who are universally beloved. And Dan is universally beloved. And I think the lesson I take away is if you actually care about other people, they like you. It's an experiment I'm not willing to try. It would be read out of the journalistic business. But it's been fun, super fun for me to work here at Aspen, to meet a lot of new colleagues, to have a core team here. And the best part is I now get to give book talks just a few steps from my office, which is very convenient for me. So I'm going to tell you two quick stories about life, which I hope will be resonant with you. And the first story is about the external story we often tell about our lives. And I'll tell you a little about the story of my life and how it started. And then I'll tell you about the internal story, which is a little more complicated. So the external story starts in New York. I grew up in Lower East Side or Greenwich Village area of New York. My parents were somewhat on the left. In 1965, they took me to a be-in in Central Park where hippies would go just to be. And one of the things they did was they set a garbage can on fire and threw their wallets into it to demonstrate how little they cared about money. And I was 5, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can. So I broke from the crowd, reached into the fire, grabbed the money, and ran away. And that was my first step over to the right. And then I read a book called Paddington the Bear when I was 7 and decided I want to become a writer. And I've been writing every day, but maybe 250 years since then. And it was the center of my values. And my joke is that in high school, this is true, I wanted to date a woman named Bernice. She didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so those were my values. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And which the best thing about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so I had a very cerebral life there. I had a double major in history and celibacy at Chicago. And then I had the big break in my life, which was William F. Buckley came to campus, and I wrote a parody of him for being a name-dropping blowhard, which was super cruel. It was like Bill Buckley at Yale founded 2 magazines, one called the National Buckley, one called the Buckley Review, which he merged to form the Buckley. And he gave a speech to the student body, and at the end of the speech he said, David Brooks, if you're in the audience, I want to give you a job. And that was the big break of my life. Sadly, I wasn't in the audience. I was actually, I'd been hired by PBS, my first PBS experience, at age 21 to go out to Stanford to debate Milton Friedman on a national TV show. I was a socialist then, and if you go into YouTube and type in Milton Friedman, David Brooks, you can see a picture of me with this big Jew fro, with these big 1980s glasses that were apparently on loan from the Mount Palomar Lunar Observatory, and me making an argument I'd read in a book, him destroying it in 6 minutes or 6 words, and then me trying to sit there think of what to say next as the camera just lingers on my face. That was sort of the show. But I did eventually call Buckley. He hired me, and I was off to the races. And I had a few stops, which I often talk about when I talk about my life. I got to be a conservative columnist at the New York Times, which is a job I liken to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Then I got a job at the NewsHour, and I'm very proud of the work that I do with Mark Shields. We have a segment called Shields and Brooks, which we should have called Brooke Shields, but they didn't go for that. And I always say we cater to a certain audience, which is a seasoned youth. So if a certain experienced demographic, so if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I always know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. And so that's sort of the people we are very big in the hospice community. And then I write these books. So I wrote a book called The Road to Character. And during writing that book, I learned that writing a book on character doesn't give you good character, and even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does actually give you good character. And so that's the external life I often tell about myself. But of course, there's another side to life which is more complicated. I went back and reread that book, Paddington, about a year ago. And I was surprised at how sad a book it is. It's about a bear who's come from Peru and is stranded in a train station and has no family. And then suddenly a family arrives and takes him in. And I was wondering, what kind of kid was I that really appealed to me? And then the second thing I remember about reading that book was I remember the intensity I felt when I read it the first time and what it felt like to have a whole new world opened. And for those of us who are lucky, who are extremely lucky, we experience what I come to think of as annunciation moments, moments that come earlier, maybe later in life, but that prefigure a lot of what's going to happen. And one of my heroes is a book called E.O. Wilson. He's a scientist. When he was 7, his parents were getting a divorce, and they shipped him away from their home in Alabama to Paradise Beach in North Florida, where he stayed with a family he didn't know. He'd never seen large bodies of water, so he spent the whole summer just wandering the beach. And he saw things that were beyond his imagination. He saw a jellyfish. Imagine never knowing about a jellyfish. Suddenly you see this weird creature. One day he was sitting on the dock, and a stingray slid just beneath his feet in the water. And he later estimated that children see animals at twice the size as adults. And he said at that moment a naturalist was born. He was losing a home back in Alabama, but he found the new world he wanted to explore. And what's interesting about these moments is how aesthetic they are. Kids see something that's just beautiful and they want to sink into that world. The Greek word for beauty is related to the word for call. They're called to it. My daughter, when she was 5, she walked into a hockey rink out in Rockville, and she just loved the feel of a hockey rink and just felt instantly at home. And now she teaches hockey for the Anaheim Ducks in California. She's found her place. Einstein, when he was 4, his dad bought him a compass, and he was struck by the way the invisible forces of the universe moved the needle. And he spent the rest of his life studying the invisible forces of the universe. Annie Dillard once interviewed a painter and asked her, why'd you become a painter? And she just said, I love the smell of paint. And it's that aesthetic sense. Nietzsche, in a rare humane moment for him, said, if you take the 4 most beautiful moments of your life and list them out and see if you can draw a thematic line through them, if there's a theme to all that beauty, then he wrote, you've discovered the law of your very nature. You've discovered your vocation in what you see as beauty. Now for Wilson, there was one other feature of his annunciation moment. Toward the end of the summer, he was fishing and he caught a pinfish, and as he was taking it off the hook, he was careless and it flopped into his face and the tail fin poked his retina. And he should have gone inside, but he wanted to stay out in the ocean because he hated leaving the water. And eventually that eye went blind. And so he could no longer study things that required telescopy, the 2 eyes. So birds were out, fish were out, but he could hold up ants to his good eye. And he became a great ant scientist and then later a great scientist. And sometimes it's a blessing to have options closed off, to narrow the mind. The second thing about being young, aside from the intensity of the aesthetic call, is the way we admire as kids. I think kids are capable of admiring adults in the way we adults are no longer capable because we sort of know people a little better. But I remember looking at teenagers when I was a kid and thinking those people are godlike. They have so much poise and strength. And when I looked at Buckley, I looked at him as another creature and a model to be aped. For E.O. Wilson, there was a guy named Philip Darlington, who was a professor at Harvard, another entomologist. And Darlington taught Wilson, when you're collecting your bug samples, don't collect on the trails, cut through the jungle. And once Darlington was in the Amazon on a pond on a log collecting samples, and a crocodile came up, grabbed him, and tore him down to the bottom. He escaped, the crocodile grabbed him again and tore him down. He escaped again, got on shore, his right side of his body shredded, and dragged himself back to camp and eventually to safety. But that wasn't what impressed Wilson. He said anybody can get away from a crocodile. What impressed Wilson was that for the next 6 months, Darlington, in a full body cast with his right arm immobilized, went out to the jungle and taught himself to collect bugs left-handed and one-handed. And I think that's what young people want, not happiness, but intensity. They want to be involved in something that is really hard, but is worthy of the hardness. And they want somebody to hold up that ideal for them. And fortunate are those of us who had that kind of mentor in our lives, who gave us that sense of high ideals. And so when I talk about childhood, what I'm really talking about is the intensity of youth, living with a mythological consciousness, all the brutal Bettelheim stuff. Unfortunately, in our culture, we take that intensity of youth and we have a tendency to cover it over. So we run our most talented 16-year-olds through the college admissions process, which teaches them that status is the center of life. And then we plug them into the meritocracy and with the lies that are embedded in our highly individualistic meritocratic culture. And they're lies like career success can make you happy. And I'm a living testimony that's not true. And in worse ways, so are Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain. The second lie is I can make myself happy. This is the lie of self-sufficiency, that if I just lose 15 pounds, get better at yoga, win one more victory, I can be happy. But if you talk to people at the end of their lives, the things they say are the happiest moments is when they defeated the lie of self-sufficiency and were utterly dependent on somebody else and somebody else was utterly dependent on them. It's relationship, not self-sufficiency. The third, that life is an individual journey. You've probably seen this book, which is very high on the bestseller list, Oh, the Places You'll Go, by Dr. Seuss, which teaches life. Life is just a series of adventures that a kid has on the way to success, and that kid has no friends, he has no family, it's all solo. I ran into a sociologist at Stanford who says immigrant kids have a great deal of trouble with that book, because that's not the life they see. And there are other lies, that you can have your own truth, and then the general lies of the meritocracy, that you are what you accomplish, you can earn dignity by attaching yourself to prestigious brands. The emotion of the meritocracy is conditional love, that you have to earn love. The sociology of the meritocracy is society is divided into inner rings for the successful and outer rings for everybody else. The anthropology of the meritocracy is that you're not a soul to be saved, you're a set of skills to be enhanced and maximized. And finally, the most pernicious message of the meritocracy, which we pretend not to tell, but we really do, which is that people who are smarter and more accomplished are worth slightly more than other people. And so what all this does is it takes the intensity of childhood and covers it over. There was a daycare center in Israel that had a problem, which was that parents were coming in late to pick up their kids. So the daycare center imposed fines on the parents who came late. And so the number of parents who came late doubled. And that's because what had previously been a moral consideration, I want to be fair to the teachers, I'll show up on time, became an economic transaction. The moral lens was numbed and the economic lens was turned on. And you can live in a culture that does a lot of turning on the economic lens and a lot of numbing the moral lens. And when you do that, you lead people into lives that are unsustainable, that will eventually hit a crisis. Because society is asking you to live a more shallow life than anybody really wants to live. And so this happened to me. Now I start with certain disadvantages just professionally in terms of having a relationship. First of all, I'm a journalist. We have distant lives. I often tell journalism students, if you're at a football game and everyone else is doing the wave and you just sit there and don't do the wave, then you have the right kind of aloof personality type to be a journalist. Because we don't do stuff, we just watch stuff. Second, a lot of us go into this kind of career of writing or painting or art because we're not really good at relating to people face to face. The only way we can really communicate is through our work. And so what we would love to experience at a party, that conviviality, we can only do at our work. Christian Wyman, a poet at Yale, says, a certain emotional reserve in one's life becomes a source of great power in one's work. Or as Gary Shandling put it, my friends tell me I have an intimacy problem, but they don't really know me. And so you get into this with a little reserve, and then you go into the writing life, which is a solitary life. John Cheever lived in New York. He would get up every morning at 6:30, put on his only suit and tie, ride the elevator to the basement of his building where he had an office, then take off his suit and tie, write for 6 hours in his boxers, put on the suit and tie, go up to his apartment and make lunch. That was the job. It's just all alone. And then if you succeed in it, it can have an even more isolating effect. So my last book did well, and I was on the road for 99 consecutive days. And in the course of that, I counted 42 consecutive meals that I ate alone, either at an airport, airplane, or hotel. And when you're moving around that much and you're not seeing anybody, you're weirdly disoriented. I remember around that time I saw a picture of Britney Spears. She kind of went berserk and shaved off all her hair. And I was like, yeah, I could do that. I'm there. You just get detached from your world and your head spins out of control. So I came to desire the wrong things. I came to desire reputation. I thought a lot about reputation management. And then I came to value time over people. I had a little invisible clock in my head that was a productivity clock. And so it meant I was always on the move. And people didn't confide in me because it takes time to have that kind of conversation, and they sensed I was always on the move, checking off the tasks that I needed to do. And so I found myself not reaching out to my closest friends, sort of drifting away from them. And I went through a period in 2013 of loneliness. My marriage had ended. My kids had left home or were leaving home to go to college. I found that I had weekday friends who I could take to lunch and talk about politics, but I did not have weekend friends, stuff people just to hang around with. And so I did what any idiot would try to do when you have a spiritual and emotional problem. I decided to work my way through it, just by just working harder. And so if you went to my apartment up here on Wisconsin Avenue, where there should have been plates in the drawers, there were Post-it notes. And where there should have been silverware, there was just stationery and envelopes. I wasn't having anybody over, I was just working. And so I was in a valley of detachment. And the weird thing is, I was in a valley, a lot of people around the country were going through the exact same thing. And so not starting around that time, but building it around that time, we saw a crisis of disconnection, which is now pervasive. 35% of Americans over 45 are chronically lonely. Only 8% of Americans report having important conversations with their neighbors. 50% of Americans say no one knows me well. Since 1999, the suicide rate is up by 30%. Since 2011, the teenage suicide rate is up by 70%. 45,000 Americans kill themselves every year, 72,000 die of opiate addiction. If you ask people, do you trust the people around you? A generation ago, 60% of Americans said, yeah, the people around me are trustworthy. Now it's down to 32% and 19% of millennials. The younger you go, the more distrust there is. And then the third crisis is hard to describe, but it's some sort of spiritual crisis. For some reason, mental health problems are skyrocketing. Depression rates are skyrocketing. If you go to any college, the mental health facilities are overwhelmed. They've maybe doubled or tripled or quadrupled the number of counselors they have, but they can't keep up with demand. And so something like that is going on, and we're in a national valley. And it shows up in how nasty we are to each other, especially in our political lives. And so I have had 6 years to think about the question, how do you get out of a valley? And the first realization I had in the valley, and the Greeks were wise to say, we suffer our way to wisdom. You learn stuff there. The first realization I had was that freedom sucks. That personal freedom, economic freedom, and political freedom are pretty good, but social freedom is no good. The unattached person is the unremembered person because they're not really committed to anything. So if you're just socially free, keeping all your options open, you're leaving, you're just scrambling yourself, you're laying waste to your powers, and you're not really contributing to anything. The second thing I learned is that you can be broken or you can be broken open. When you're broken, you turn fearful, resentful, covered up, and capable of giving or receiving love. And often you lash out in anger and resentment. There's a great saying, pain that is not transformed gets transmitted. People have been hurt who don't do something with that pain, they lash out and pass it along. And one of the things large groups of people do when they're hurt and broken is, and left naked and alone, they do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do, which is they revert to tribe. And tribe seems like community, seems like a way of being with community, but it's the opposite of community. Community is mutual love for something. We love our town, we love our cause. Tribe is mutual hatred for another. It's always us, them, friend, enemy, scarcity mentality, build walls, erect barriers, life is war. And we see a lot of tribalism in a culture because we have a broken culture. Some people, on the other hand, get broken open. The suffering, Paul Tillich said, moments of suffering, and we all have these moments, they interrupt your life and they remind you you're not the person you thought you were. Tillich says what they do is they carve down into the floor of the basement of your soul and they reveal a cavity below that, and then they carve through that floor and reveal a cavity below. You see deeper into yourself than you ever did before. And I always ask people, what was the experience that made you who you are? Nobody ever said, I had a great vacation in Hawaii. It's always the dark moments and how you respond to adversity that people say. And so when you see into yourself, you see deeper sets of desires. The world encourages our ego desires, the desires of the ego, to be better than, to succeed, to get a good reputation, to make a mark, to build an identity. But there are other locuses of desire that you see when you're actually in one of those valleys. And the first is the desiring heart. the desire to be fused with one another. And the heart desires, most of all, complete the union with another person, the kind of union that Louis de Bernier described in a book called Captain Corelli's Mandolin. He is an old guy talking to his daughter about his relationship with his late wife. And the old guy says, love itself is what is left over when being in love is burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew towards each other underground, and when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found out that we were one tree and not two. And it's that kind of fusion is what we want. The second thing, locus of desire you find, aside from the desire to build relationship, is the desire to serve some good. And these are the desires of the soul. Now we're at the Aspen Institute. If I asked you to believe in God or not believe in God, the walls would cave in on us. So I don't ask you about that. But I do ask you to believe that you have a soul. I ask you to believe that there's some piece of you that has no size, weight, shape, or color, but gives you infinite value and dignity. That rape isn't just an attack on a bunch of physical molecules, it's an assault on a human soul. That slavery is wrong because it's an obliteration of another soul. That obscenity is whatever covers over another person's soul. And what the soul does is, first, it gives us moral responsibility. A tiger's not morally responsible for what it does, but we are. The second thing it does, it gives us our fundamental equality. Our brains are not all equal. Our strength is not all equal, but our souls are all equal. And that's why human beings are equal. The third thing it does is it yearns for goodness. It yearns to live a life of meaning. I've interviewed a lot of really bad people in the world. I've never met one who didn't want to lead a meaningful life. Something about the human nature is we want good. We want to lead a good, meaningful, and purposeful life. And we want to see ourselves caught in good and evil. There's a great passage from John Steinbeck in East of Eden. Humans are caught in their lives, in their thoughts, in their hungers, and their ambitions, in a net of good and evil. I think this is the only story we have, and it occurs on all levels of consciousness. A man, after he has brushed off the dust and chips of his life, will have left only that hard, clean question. Was it good or was it evil? Have I done well or ill? In other words, the moral lens gets turned on at these moments, and the emotional lens gets turned on, and the ego lens a little gets shut away. And that's all to the good. And that leads to the third realization one has in the Valley, which is a formulation from Einstein, which is that you're not going to solve your problem on the same level of consciousness at which you created it. You've got to have a bigger mind to get to where you need to go and to get out of the valley. And so what you have people do is they have deeper conversations with their friends than they ever had before. They often go out alone into the wilderness. And the virtue of that is, if you're the sort of person who performs for others, you want others to like you, out in the wilderness, the trees and the rocks don't care. There's nobody to perform for. And what you do is you discover the depths of yourself, what Annie Dillard called our complex and illimitable caring for each other. At the bottom of ourselves, there's just this mysterious sense, there's a depth of care that humans have for each other, which is enchanted and mysterious. Penguins are really loyal to each other, but we have a level of depth and care which is magical. One of my friends said when her first daughter was born, she realized she loved her more than evolution required. And I've always loved that comment because it suggests that inexplicable caring we have for one another. And when you've discovered the depths, those depths and sort of the mystery of it and the enchantment of it, you're ready for a bigger, more enchanted and better life and a larger life, a second journey. The final thing I think I learned down in the valley is you can't pull yourself out on your own. Somebody else has to reach down and pull you out. And I got a lucky break in 2015, and I was invited over to the house of a couple named Kathy and David who lived in Crestwood up on 17th Street. And I was accepting invitations in those days, so I just showed up. And Kathy and David had a kid at Wilson, the DC public school, and his name was James, and his mom had some health issues, had no place to sleep and nothing to eat. And so they said, well, James can stay with us sometimes. And then James had a friend, and that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. And by the time I show up in 2015, I walk into the house, there's 40 kids around the dinner table and 15 sleeping around the house. And I walk in there, and there's a kid named Ed, and I introduce myself to shake his hand, and he says, we don't shake hands here. We just hug here. And I'm not the huggiest guy on the face of the earth, but for the ensuing years, I've been hugging every Thursday night with these kids. And what the kids did was they showed me a better way to live at your depths instead of at your shallows. The kids, their great gift is emotional transparency. They show you what they're feeling at every second, and they demand you show that kind of affection back to them. They insist upon an interest in their action. And we eat the same thing, chicken and black rice. We go around the table and talk about what went well, what went bad. Sometimes it's good news, a kid got a job. Sometimes it's bad news, a pregnancy, depression. One of the girls, her kidney failed, and David, the father figure, gave her one of his. I took my daughter there, and she said, that's the warmest place I've ever been in my life. And so you're just bathed in warmth and support. I took a friend named Bill Milliken there who started something called Communities in Schools, and he said, I've been doing youth work for 50 years. I've never seen a program turn around a life. I've just seen relationships turn around lives. And that is the truth of what AOK, this community, has. They just have very thick and loving relationships, one with another. And so they sort of taught me how to live, a better way to live, and changed just the way I act. I'm a little more vulnerable to people. People confide in me a little more. I still don't know what to say, but at least I know I should give them a hug. And the good news is that people like AOK are all around the country. And we founded Weave at Aspen, Weave, the Social Fabric Project, to find these weavers, figuring if all the things I read about my day job, AOK and weavers are the solution. They're being solved locally, communities being built locally around the country every day. How do we learn from their example and nationalize their effect? How do we lift up their values? So some of the Weave team is in the back there. We went around the country meeting as many as we could. We met a woman named Aisha Butler in Chicago. She lived in Englewood, tough neighborhood there, and she was going to move out because it was dangerous. She had a 9-year-old girl. And on the day she was moving out, she looks across the street at the empty lot and sees a girl in a pink dress playing with broken bottles and tells her husband, we're not leaving. We're not going to be just another family that left that. And so she went into Google and said, volunteer in Englewood. She didn't know what to do. She started volunteering and now runs RAGE, which is the big community organization in Englewood. Some of the people we met on our trip had horrible valleys. The worst day, I don't know if Isabella's here, but we spent a day with a woman named Sarah Atkins in Ohio. She comes home from antiquing with her mom one afternoon, a Sunday evening, and finds that her husband has killed their kids and himself. And she now runs a free pharmacy. She helps women who've suffered from violence. She teaches. She told us, I grew from this experience because I was angry. I was going to fight back against what he tried to do to me by making a difference in the world. See, he didn't kill me. My response to him is, whatever you tried to do to me, screw you, you're not going to do it to me. And so when we met the Weavers, I mentioned the lies of the meritocracy. Their value system is very different. They have moral motivation. They have vocational certitude. They know why they were placed on this earth. They practice radical hospitality. If you knock on their door, they let you in. They treat the whole person, heart, mind, body, and soul, and not just the ego. They, at root, they're just really good at relationships and really orienting around relationship at depth. One of my favorite organizations is called Roots of Empathy, run by a woman named Mary Gordon. And what she does is she teaches empathy to 8th graders. She takes an infant and a mom, puts it in an 8th grade classroom, and the students sit around the infant and try to guess what's going on in the infant's mind as it crawls around grabbing for stuff. It's a way to enter another person's mind. And one day there was a kid named Darren, and Darren was bigger than everybody else because he'd been held back 2 years. He'd been through the foster care system, had seen his mom killed. And he asked the mom, can I hold your baby? And the mom was nervous because Darren was bigger than everybody else and looked a little scary. But she let him hold the baby. And he held the baby, and he was great with the baby. He held it on his chest, took it over the window, showed it the window, handed it back, and started asking questions about parenting. The last of which was, if nobody has ever loved you, do you still think you can be a good father? And so what Roots of Empathy does is they reach down and they help the Darrens of the world. And the good thing is a lot of this is just helping people up, but a lot of it is spreading a value system and getting people to behave differently by setting an example and creating a moral ecology. And I'll embarrass somebody who's here in the audience who I think a story that to me illustrates, epitomizes how you can change lives by just setting a moral ecology, a culture. So one of the most impressive organizations, if not the most, that I've come across is Thread in Baltimore, run by Sarah Heminger, who's sitting right there. And Thread is a very sophisticated way of creating community around underperforming kids. And I won't tell you the whole backstory, though you can talk to Sarah later and learn it. But basically, they town underperforming kids in with circles of volunteers. And then the volunteers have circles of coaches and support units. So it's this elaborate social network around an underperforming kid, not only to help the underperforming kid, but to help the people within the network. So the whole city, you can create networks and you'll have a good, healthy community, healthy city. And that's one of the magic pieces of what Thread is doing. But the piece that is impressive to me is the way it sets a culture of good relationship for all the people who get touched by Thread. And so there's a culture there of showing all the way up, of calling a thing, which means vulnerability and honesty within a context of love. And how many of us actually in our lives do total vulnerability? And so there's a woman named Michelle I met through Sarah, who's on the board, a successful businesswoman. And at the board, I gather that these board meetings are, people really show up. They really tell their stories. And Sarah had, Michelle had not told a certain story of her life, which was the story of her childhood. She hadn't even told it to her family. And the story was that her father was abusive. And she's Asian American, and she had thick black hair, and she would say, I'm glad I have thick black hair, because nobody at school can see the black welts that I get when he punches me. And she tried to overdose on pills as a teenager and found that it's actually hard to swallow 100 pills. She never told anybody, even her family, until the board culture surrounded her, and she told the board. And then she told her family. And then she wrote a memo, which she allowed me to place in this book. And what's interesting to me is how a woman can go through life hiding this and keeping a piece of herself buried and therefore not really in full relationship. And then eating a culture where vulnerability is rewarded and deep relationship is valued, and her mindset can change. And she can see a different way to live. In this memo she writes, which is in the book, I remember clearly what it was like to be 14 and trapped and powerless, and that's why I show up for Thread. Thread has given me the gift of the Thread lens. At this point, my Thread lens has allowed me to examine my weaknesses. The Thread lens has allowed me to recognize the richness of relationships. She took her daughter to an Elton John concert in Baltimore recently, and she used to listen to Elton John when she was in her dark childhood, contemplating suicide. And she took her 13-year-old daughter there to the concert and began crying. And she wrote, I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was overcome by emotions as my mind whipsawed between the stark contrast of my bleak childhood and my splendid adult life. I was listening to his music with my 13-year-old daughter, both of us laughing. My life now is rich and strong with healthy relationships. Life has turned out to be so much better than I ever imagined. And that's someone whose life has been turned around not only financially, but spiritually and emotionally. And so the hope of Weave, what we do here, is to shine a light on people who found a better way to live, a deeper way to live than, frankly, we usually talk about in Washington, which is like the most emotionally avoidant city on the face of the earth. And to shift the culture a little around them so people are more inclined to show all the way up and to express with vulnerability and then to actually build community and relationship. And it's not just professional people who run organizations. It's all of us with our neighbors. It's all of us with the kids in their lives. It's all of us having some bridging experience so we find ourselves on a regular basis with people completely unlike ourselves. And when we do that, society will improve a little. And when we do that, we will have shifted the culture from the hyper-individualism, the meritocracy, the competitive, the ego orientation we have to something a little better. And this book is just a small effort to push us in that direction. Thank you. Now we have microphones for anybody who wants to ask questions, and I only ask that only 80% of them be about the Mueller report. I see one right there, and
Yes, thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. That was a very fine presentation. I've read your books, and the first time I saw you in person was at Aspen in 2013, when you gave a talk about Atom 1 and Atom 2 that kind of has changed my life since then. But I wanted to ask you, and maybe a little bit off the track, but you talked about in that presentation when you were out taking a walk, taking a break up in the mountains, you saw a yellow-bellied marmoset, and the mountains were peaceful and this and that, and you said, and it was then that I really believe I had a feeling of, and my wife next to me said, grace, and you said grace. I'd like to know what you think about grace and where it fits into whatever you're doing.
yeah. I had a, this is a 45-minute answer, but there's a chapter in the book on this subject. The short answer is, I would say, my friend Chris Wyman is a poet, and he said, as I went through life, the categories I have for life were not adequate to the reality as I experienced it. And what he meant by that, the categories we have for life can often be secular categories and material categories. But there are certain moments of transcendence where something peers through from the immaterial world. And 83% of Americans have had these experiences. And for me, that was a moment up in, it's called American Lake near Aspen. And I was reading a book of prayers, Puritan prayers, called The Valley of Vision. And the first line of the prayer I read was high and holy, meek and lowly. And the high and holy was the mountains, and the meek and lowly was the marmoset. And then it was just a whole series of things that seemed to perfectly apply. I see vision in the valley, and I've forgotten all of the poem right now. But I remember having the sensation of a sense of that we live in a created order that is still being created. And it was just a sense of something. And it sounded like things clicking into place, like when you close the door on a really high-end Mercedes. It was just like clicking into place. And we've all had those moments. I mean, there's one moment that I had earlier I sometimes talk about. I was driving home from the NewsHour on a Sunday or a Friday night, living in Bethesda, and I pulled into my driveway. I see my kids playing in the backyard, and they're playing with a ball, and they're running across the backyard and just tumbling all over each other. They're like 12, 9, and 4 at that point. And they're just having the greatest time, pure joy. And the summer sun is coming through the trees, and for some reason my lawn looked perfect. And I sat there behind the wheel just staring at this tableau of complete happiness. And in those moments, sort of reality spills its bounds, time stops, and you become aware of a happiness that you never get at work and that you can't possibly deserve, which is grace. And so as Wyman says, what you try to do is those moments, religion is not based on continuity of those moments. But it's incorporating those moments into your life. So they're not just interruptions of your life, but the better awareness you get at those moments is incorporated in how you live. I'll give another Wyman moment that is of this nature. So whenever you talk to him about where he was living as a young man, he always went there because there was some woman there. Why'd you live in Cincinnati? Oh, there was a woman there. Buffalo, woman there. So Chris was living in Prague because his girlfriend lived there, and he was writing poetry on the kitchen table, and suddenly a falcon lands on the windowsill on the other side of the pane, and he's transfixed by the beauty of the bird. So he calls out to his girlfriend who's in the shower, come here, you gotta see this. She comes out dripping wet, and they stare at the bird. And then the bird twists its head and locks eyes with Wyman. And Wyman said, I felt my stomach just cratering on itself. I peered into the eyes of the bird like I was staring into centuries. And his girlfriend, understanding the power of the moment, said, make a wish. And so he wrote a poem about it, which has the stanza, I wished, and I wished that that moment would never stop. And just like that, it vanished. And so there are just certain moments. And then the final thing, and this is to me is the most welcome description of faith, it's from Fred Buechner, who was a novelist. And he said, if you wake up every morning, you should ask yourself, can I believe it all again, if you're a believer? He says, if you say yes 10 days in a row, you probably don't know what faith is. You should say no 5 days out of 10 at least, and that proves you're human. The no's are important. But on the day or two out of 10 where you can say, yes, I do believe all that stuff, you should say it with great laughter. And to me, these are accurate descriptions of what faith is like, rather than, oh, you know, God told me to order a cheeseburger, not the salmon. Like, it's like, so one of the things of coming into faith is having a credible description of it. And I value the people like Wyman and Beacon who give me what seems like a credible description of it. And then you can incorporate that into moments like up at Aspen Lake. Thanks for the question. Right here or back there?
You've referred extensively, I think, to faith and to the concept of the soul, spirituality. Could you point to a source or two or a thinker or two within your Jewish tradition that have been influential in your thinking about these matters?
Sure. One of my great teachers is Joseph Soloveitchik, who the last book was sort of organized around that. And Soloveitchik has a footnote in a book called Halakhic Man, which says, you know, faith is not the opiate of the masses. Faith is running down the rapids of a very rocky thing, a rocky river. And it's the rapids and the bumps that robs faith of its sentimentality. So Martin Buber would be another who captures the mysticism of it. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who captures the relationality of it. David Wolpe, who's a rabbi out in Los Angeles, who says he's a defender of organized faith. He said spirituality is satisfied with itself, but organized religion is dissatisfied with the world. And what he means by that is spiritual. And if you're just spiritual, it's too easy to grade yourself on a curve and think, yeah, I'm good, I'm spiritual. But if you're in an actual organized body, that organized body will drive you crazy 90% of the time. But it'll also set a standard that you will fail at, which is important. Here, and we can go back after that. There's somebody back there.
David, thanks very much. The term you used at the very beginning of your talk about moments of enunciation or enunciation moments struck a responsive chord with me in one sense, and in the other sense, I said to myself, how is that different from an aha moment? How is it different from an epiphany? So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about the enunciation moments.
Yeah, well, I think we have them. The problem is not having an enunciation moment. There are moments in childhood that we're all called by beauty. The problem is realizing you're having one and looking back upon them. Aha moments strike me as things where you discover a truth. And that's important. But when I speak of an enunciation moment, I think of it encountering a beauty. And so when I went to a school which really was my mascot, the University of Chicago, and what the professors taught us is what to fall in love with. And so when I went there were still refugees from World War II who were still alive there teaching, and they taught us the great books, and they taught us like they had the keys to the Magic Kingdom. They said, if you study these books well, this is Mortimer Adler who founded Aspen and people like that, then you will know how to live the worthy life. And there's a saying, if you catch fire with enthusiasm, people will come for miles to watch you burn. And they really taught us to burn for these books. And it wasn't like we had a new epiphany, but we just had a respect for a realm that was sacred. And I remember once I was reading Nietzsche in the Regenstein Library at Chicago, which is possibly the ugliest building on the face of the earth. And I started reading at 4 p.m., and at 10 p.m. I looked up and realized I'd been there for 6 hours, and that I was not in the book. I was not in myself, I was in the book. And at that moment, you capture an addiction to something, which was trying to make yourself less shallow than you would otherwise be. And after you've tasted Nietzsche and Aristotle, it's hard to be settled for the cheap stuff. It's hard to be as shallow as you otherwise would be. You've tasted the fine wine. And so those are moments when you get captured by beauty. And the final thing I'll say about Chicago, which is so valuable in a university, is they taught us how to see. And you would think seeing is easy, but we live in Washington, most of us, and in politics, most people don't see the world honestly. They see what they want to see. And the great academic teaches you, and even an institution like this teaches you to see the world honestly and directly. John Ruskin was a great hero of mine who said that as I get older, the more I realize that the best thing a human being can do is see the world directly and describe what he saw in a plain way. 1,000 can talk for one who can think, but 10,000 can think for one who can see. And to be around people, to read Tolstoy or to read George Orwell or C.S. Lewis, is to be around people who really know how to see the world honestly and directly. And that's just it's like an emotional gift. So an annunciation moment doesn't touch you just the way an epiphany, like, oh, I understand now. It's discovering a love, discovering a love. Angela Lawson, who I think works here, she once observed to me, as children, we were all missing something, and as adults, we're willing to give up a lot in order to get it. And the demon, the thing that touches us, is often related to some pain and some loss.
Hello? Okay.
Hello.
My question is, as a high school junior, I am currently finding my passion in who I am. What piece of advice would you give your 11th grade self in order to find your true self?
Okay. So in my book, I talk about how I have the first mountain where you build a career, and then I went in the valley when I found that unsatisfying, and the second mountain was a better mountain. So my advice to you is avoid that valley thing. Like, start off right. And the way you do that, in my view, is to overinvest in your friendships. I have a friend who's a student who said, my life is about putting out fires. If I have a test, then that's a fire I got to put out. If I have a paper due, that's a fire. My girlfriend is sometimes on fire. My friends are never on fire. And so there's a tendency to want to put them in the back burner. But life after high school and life after college has its moments of loneliness, heartbreak, failure. You really need your friends. And so I have a friend, and she says, I practice aggressive friendship. And aggressive friendship is being the one to organize the annual get-togethers, or the weekly get-togethers, or the going out on the picnic and barbecue, go on the mall and play softball. Don't play kickball, that's lame. But for example, I have a friend who, when he got out of school, he had a lot of really good friends in school. And he said, how do I keep these friendships through life? So what they did was they created a giving circle. And they didn't have any money at the time. But every year they put some money into a common pot. And then every year they got together on a retreat for 4 days, figuring out how to spend the money. And the giving circle wasn't really just to give away money. It was for them to have occasion to do life together. And so that organized friendship is, that would be my advice, overinvest in relationships, because the world isn't going to give you that message necessarily. Thank you for coming and asking that. Maybe one more. Amitai here.
So, David Gangs and Hitler Youth and the Cosmos have many of the things you're talking about. They have closeness, they have openness, they have hugs. Do we have to add to the story a moral judgment if we compare their content to somebody else's content?
Okay. This is Amitai Etzioni, who created the communitarian movement in this country and in the world. So everything I've said is just a footnote on Amitai. And you know the answer to this question better than I do, but I would say, and I tried to make this distinction between tribalism and community. Now, we don't have great words for this. For Native Americans, the word tribe is a very positive word. But in the way I use it, it's based on a scarcity mentality, that the awareness that there's not enough and that resources are essentially or that life is a competition for scarce resources. And the people who have that tribal mentality are always in an us versus them. They're trying to take it away from us. People with a abundance mentality think, well, I have my group, which I love my town here, and they love their town over there. I love America, they love France, they're French, that's good, it's no threat to me. And so an abundance mentality is different from a scarcity mentality. And an abundance mentality is never trying to, I need to build myself up by crushing other people. And I do think one of the things we have to develop in this country, and I don't know how to do this, I'd love to talk to you about it, is a thick pluralism. Because we have settled for, we've got a diverse country. We're going to be a majority-minority country in a few years. And in most parts, for young people, it's already come into existence. And it's easy to have a faith in diversity that is spiritually and emotionally thin. And people find that unsatisfying and unnerving, and they become fanatics. Hannah Arendt said that fanaticism grows out of existential anxiety, not being deeply planted. So somehow we have to have a sort of pluralism that understands that we're all different and we can all love our community and then expand it outward. But that is not spiritually thin, because the fanaticisms are all spiritually thick, like the Nazis, the gang members, the Antifa, or the racist right. They're all self-enclosing fanaticisms. And so having a pluralism that's emotionally and spiritually thick seems to me the challenge of the moment. I better close there. I think we are done here. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Books are for sale by the elevator, and book signings will take place right by me. Thank you.